June 23rd, 1592, Busan, Joseon. The morning sun barely peeked over the mountains, casting its pale light over the bay. The sea, usually serene, seemed restless today, the winds carrying an unsettling stillness. I stood atop the fortress wall in Busan, gripping my spear, gazing out over the shimmering water. There had been rumors for months of Japanese forces stirring like an angry storm across the sea, but none of us could truly believe it, not until today. My name is Yi Sun-jo, a soldier of the Joseon army. For 10 years I have served, training diligently under the command of my superiors. Though our country has enjoyed a long peace, we knew the strength of our arms was all that kept the wolves at bay. Still, we were not prepared for the horror that was to come. By mid-morning, the horizon darkened with the shapes of hundreds of ships, more than I had ever imagined. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as their sails grew larger, filling the harbor. The banners of the Japanese daimyo fluttered in the wind, a sea of red and black, like a shadow swallowing the horizon. My commander, General Jongbal, rode out to inspect the defenses, his face grim but determined. "Stand firm," he shouted, his voice booming through the ranks. "We will hold Busan or die trying." As the first ships landed ashore, the sight that greeted us shook the very core of our spirits. The Japanese came ashore in droves, wearing strange armor and wielding weapons we had only heard of, long muskets that roared with fire and steel. The sound of their firearms echoed off the cliffs, shaking the air itself. We had bows, spears and swords, but no amount of training could prepare us for the shock of those weapons. The battle began in chaos. I stood at the gate, my spear trembling in my hand as waves of Japanese soldiers poured from the ships. Our archers loosed their arrows, and for a brief moment it seemed we might hold them back. But then came the blast of gunfire, thunderclaps that shattered our lines. Men fell beside me, their bodies twisted and broken by the musket balls. Blood soaked the earth, and the stench of gunpowder filled the air. I fought desperately, thrusting my spear into the enemy, blocking blows with my shield. But there were too many. They fought with a ferocity I had never seen before, fast, efficient, deadly. The muskets were terrifying, but their swordsmen were no less fearsome. They cut through our lines like farmers harvesting grain. In the chaos, I caught sight of General Jongbal. He fought like a man possessed, cutting down the invaders with a ferocious rage. But even he could not turn the tide. The walls were breached, and soon the Japanese were pouring into the city itself. Panic swept through our ranks, and I found myself retreating with the others, back into the narrow streets of Busan. The sound of battle echoed off the walls, and I could hear the cries of the civilians, trapped in their homes. As we fell back, the sky darkened with the smoke of burning buildings. The Japanese set fire to the city, and flames licked the edges of the fortress. My comrades and I regrouped in the marketplace, where we made our final stand. We knew there was no escape, no reinforcements coming. Our fate was sealed. In those last moments, I remembered the stories of our ancestors, of great warriors who defended our lands from foreign invaders. I knew that we would not win today, but we would not be forgotten. We would fight to the last breath, so that future generations would know that the men of Joseon did not surrender easily. The enemy descended upon us once more. I raised my spear, shouting with all the strength left in my body. "For Joseon, for our king!" The clash of steel drowned out my voice, and the battle raged on. This is how Busan fell, the beginning of a war that would consume our nation. July 7th, 1592, the Battle of Sangju. It has been weeks since Busan fell, and the memories of that day still haunt my every waking moment. The flames, the screams, the sound of muskets tearing through flesh. The Japanese swept through the southern provinces like wildfire, conquering one city after another with terrifying speed. But we did not surrender. Joseon would not break so easily. After retreating from Busan, we regrouped under the command of General Yi Il, a seasoned warrior who had seen many battles in his day. Our orders were clear: hold Sangju. The city sat at a vital crossroads in Gyeongsang province, and if it fell, the Japanese would have a direct route toward the heart of our kingdom. The king himself had ordered our defense, and we would not fail him. I had been assigned to a unit of infantry, along with other survivors from Busan. We were weary, our spirits dampened by the horror of what we had witnessed. But we had new recruits with us now, men who had not yet tasted the bitterness of defeat. They were eager, full of fire, and I envied their resolve. But I feared it would not last long. As the sun rose over Sangju, we heard the unmistakable sounds of the Japanese army approaching. They moved swiftly and silently, like ghosts in the mist. I stood on the ridge, just outside the city, gripping my spear, my heart racing. The enemy was coming. Another flood of those deadly musketeers and swordsmen. We had been warned, and yet I could not shake the fear that gripped me. General Yi Il stood before us, his face as hard as stone. "Hold your ground," he shouted, pacing before our lines. "The Japanese may have taken Busan, but they will not take Sangju. Today, we fight not only for this city, but for the honor of Joseon." The sound of our warriors' war cries filled the air as we readied ourselves for battle. I tightened my grip on my weapon, remembering the oath I had taken. An oath to protect this land, my family, my people. I could not fail them, not today. The Japanese vanguard appeared first, lines of musketeers marching in perfect formation. I knew what would come next, and my stomach churned. The blast of their muskets was deafening. The first volley tore through our front lines, sending men crumpling to the ground. Blood stained the grass, and the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Still, we held our ground, returning fire with arrows and charging toward them with spears and swords. The clash was brutal. Our arrows were swift and deadly, but they could not match the range and precision of the muskets. As I fought, the world became a blur of steel and smoke. I swung my spear wildly, parrying blows and thrusting it into the nearest enemy. Their swordsmen were upon us now, skilled and merciless. I fought to keep my footing, the ground slick with the blood of my fallen comrades. All around me, men screamed, steel clashed, and the sound of musket fire rang in my ears. The Japanese were relentless, pushing us back step by step. I could feel the tide of battle turning, just as it had in Busan. My heart sank. No matter how hard we fought, their numbers, their weapons, they were too much. But then, something unexpected happened. From the hills to the east, I heard the sound of horses galloping. Our cavalry. A unit led by General Yi Il himself had flanked the Japanese. With a thunderous charge, they swept down upon the enemy, cutting into their ranks. The sight of our cavalry gave us hope, and we rallied, fighting back with renewed fury. For a moment, it seemed we might turn the tide. But the Japanese had prepared for this. They wheeled around with terrifying speed, their musketeers firing in disciplined volleys that ripped through our cavalry. The horses screamed, their riders falling, pierced by bullets. What hope we had was quickly crushed. In the chaos, I saw General Yi Il retreating with the remnants of his force. He had been forced to abandon the field. The Japanese were too strong. Our lines crumbled, and we were ordered to fall back. The retreat was a nightmare. We fled through the narrow streets of Sangju, pursued by the relentless Japanese forces. Buildings burned, and the sky was black with smoke. We had lost again. Another city had fallen. As I ran, I thought of what lay ahead. Our capital, Hanyang, was vulnerable. If the Japanese reached it, everything we had fought for would be lost. But I could not allow despair to take hold. Joseon was not yet defeated. There were still battles to fight, and we would find a way to resist. We had to. The spirit of our people, our ancestors, demanded it. Today, we lost Sangju, but the war is far from over, and I will fight until my last breath to defend my homeland. July 16th, 1592. The Battle of Cheongju. It has been a week since the fall of Sangju, and our defeat still hangs over us like a dark cloud. We retreated north, regrouping at Cheongju, the last line of defense before Hanyang, our capital. Fear gnawed at the hearts of my comrades, but there was also a burning resolve. We could not allow the Japanese to march any further into our land. If Cheongju fell, Hanyang would be next. And if the capital fell, what then? General Shinrip had taken command of our forces here. He was a man of great reputation, a veteran warrior known for his cunning. He had gathered what remained of our army, along with new recruits and local militia, forming a force that looked formidable on paper. But in truth, many of us were exhausted, demoralized, and terrified of what lay ahead. We knew the enemy we faced. Ruthless, disciplined, and armed with their terrifying muskets. I was part of the infantry again, positioned on the banks of the Tanjumde River. General Shin had decided to use the river as a natural defense, placing us in a valley with steep hills on either side. He believed the terrain would slow the Japanese advance, giving us the advantage. But as I stood there, spear in hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were trapped. The river was at our backs, and the hills seemed more like walls than protection. The sky was overcast that morning, a heavy grey that matched the mood of the army. We stood in silence, waiting for the inevitable. The Japanese were coming. We could hear the distant sound of drums, the rhythmic march of their soldiers growing louder with each passing minute. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I tried to steady my breathing, gripping my spear tighter, reminding myself why I was here. For my family, for Joseon. When the enemy finally appeared, they came in force. The Japanese army marched over the hills, their banners flying high, the black and red symbols of their daimyo bold against the sky. At their front were the musketeers, the same soldiers who had shattered our lines at Busan and Sangju. Behind them, more infantry, swordsmen, and cavalry. It seemed like an endless tide, far larger than we had anticipated. General Shin Rip ordered us to hold our ground, to wait for the right moment to strike. Our archers were positioned on the hills, ready to rain arrows down on the enemy. But the Japanese were not so easily deterred. As soon as they were within range, their muskets thundered, filling the air with the sound of gunfire. The first volley hit us hard, and men around me fell like wheat cut by a scythe. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of blood in the air. Despite the heavy fire, we charged. We had no choice. Our commanders urged us forward, and we ran toward the enemy, shouting our battle cries. I remember the fear that gripped me in that moment, the sheer terror of running into that wall of death. But I could not stop. None of us could. We clashed with the Japanese on the riverbank, and the battle descended into chaos. I thrust my spear into the chest of an enemy soldier, feeling the impact shudder through my arms. Around me, men screamed and fell, their bodies trampled into the mud. The musketeers continued to fire, even as their swordsmen engaged us in brutal hand-to-hand combat. I fought as best I could, blocking blows with my shield, striking back with every ounce of strength I had left. But it wasn't enough. The Japanese were relentless, their discipline unmatched. They moved in perfect coordination, their musketeers reloading and firing in deadly rhythm while their swordsmen cut through our ranks. I saw General Shin Rip riding along the lines, shouting orders, but even he could not change the course of the battle. It was then that the trap we feared became clear. The valley was too narrow, the river at our backs preventing any real retreat. We were pinned. The Japanese pushed us further and further toward the water, their muskets and swords cutting down anyone who tried to resist. Panic spread through our ranks. Men began to flee, desperate to escape the slaughter, but there was nowhere to go. I remember falling. Whether from exhaustion or a blow, I don't know. The world spun around me as I lay in the mud, the battle raging above me. The screams of the dying filled my ears, and the sky seemed to darken even further. I thought it was the end, for me, for Joseon. But I was pulled to my feet by a fellow soldier, and together we stumbled toward the river. There was no honor left in the retreat, only survival. We crossed the Tanjumde, barely escaping with our lives. General Shin Rip and many of our comrades were not so fortunate. The Japanese slaughtered those who remained, and Cheongju fell just as Sangju had before it. We retreated again, this time toward the capital. There was no time to mourn the dead, no time to reflect on our failures. The Japanese were unstoppable, and now Hanyang lay directly in their path. I don't know what will happen next, but I do know this. I will fight again, even if it means my death. I have no other choice. Yi Sunjo, soldier of Joseon.